Okay, so the next part of the brain is diencephalon. This is the physical center of the brain, and it's actually composed of four different components, each with its own nuclei, which are centers of cell bodies of neurons that receive specific input and send output to other brain regions. So this is really where you have a lot of information coming from sensory receptors, and then it's also going to integrate, process it, and then send it to the appropriate regions of the brain where it needs to go. There are four parts to this: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, and the subthalamus. So the thalamus is the main entry route for sensory data into the cerebral cortex. So all information coming from all aspects of the body are going to end up going through the thalamus. It consists of two egg-shaped regions of gray matter that make up about 80% of the diencephalon. So the thalamus is the primary structure of this area of the brain. It is located between the third ventricle. The third ventricle is found between these two regions. And the thalamic nuclei will receive afferent fibers, or afferent or sensory fibers, from many other regions of the nervous system, excluding information about the sense of smell. The thalamus will also regulate cortical activity by controlling which input should continue to the cerebral cortex. It is the gatekeeper. Each half of the thalamus has three main groups of nuclei, which are separated by a thin layer of white matter. The specific nuclei function as relay stations that will receive input, integrate the information, and send the information to the specific motor or sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. The association nuclei, this is going to receive input from a variety of sources throughout the body, process information related to emotions, memory, and integration of sensory information, and then the processed information is then sent on to the appropriate association areas of the cerebral cortex. The non-specific nuclei will receive information from the basal nuclei, the cerebellum, and the motor cortex. It will then send information to a wide range of locations, including the cerebral cortex and other brain regions. This is also involved in controlling arousal, consciousness, and level of responsiveness and excitability of the cortex. So essentially, when we talk about keeping responsiveness and excitability of the cortex, remember, this is your conscious brain. This is the part that you are consciously aware of. Second structure is the hypothalamus. Now, we've talked about the hypothalamus a little bit with the endocrine system. The hypothalamus is also a collection of nuclei. Again, nuclei are just bundles of cell bodies, anterior and inferior to the larger thalamus. The neurons of the hypothalamus will perform several vital functions critical to survival, include regulation of autonomic nervous system, sleep-wake cycles, thirst and hunger, and body temperature regulation. The inferior hypothalamus, this is anatomically and functionally linked to the pituitary gland by an extension called the infundibulum. Hypothalamic tissue makes up the posterior portion of this endocrine gland. Remember that the posterior pituitary is not making any hormones. It's actually receiving hormones from the hypothalamus, ADH and oxytocin, and those two hormones are under neuroregulation for secretion by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus also secretes a number of different releasing and inhibiting hormones, which will affect the function of the pituitary gland. In turn, pituitary gland secretes hormones that affect activities of other endocrine glands throughout the body. So this sort of sets up that huge tropic relationship as far as regulation is concerned with the anterior pituitary. The two hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus are ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. These hormones do not affect the pituitary gland, They have their own effect on water balance for ADH or stimulation of the uterine contractions during childbirth for oxytocin. Input to the hypothalamus arrives from many sources, including the cortex and the basal nuclei. The mammillary bodies of the hypothalamus, these will connect the hypothalamus with the limbic system. The limbic system is the area where you have your personality, behavior, mental states. This will receive information from the hippocampus, which is involved in memory regulation and overall behavior. Input from outside nervous system, the endocrine system, among others, provides information from receptors that detect changes in body temperature and receptors that detect changes in osmotic concentrations of blood, such as, do we see a difference in calcium blood levels or, other magnesium blood levels. These are all being sent to the hypothalamus for further regulation. The epithalamus, this is the superior portion to the thalamus. Most of it is the posterior superior bulk is an endocrine gland called the pineal gland. And we talked about the pineal gland with the endocrine system where it secretes melatonin. And melatonin is a cyclical hormone that is responsible for your sleep-wake cycles. And finally, the fourth structure of the diencephalon is the subthalamus. This is inferior to the thalamus, functionally connected with the basal nuclei. Together, they will control movements. So here's the the diencephalon. You can see the thalamus here. Here's the hypothalamus region right here. Here's your pituitary gland, anterior, posterior portions. Subthalamus is underneath the thalamus. And then your epithalamus is right here, primarily just consisting of the pineal gland. And respectively, this is in the core of the overall brain right here. Third region of the brain is called the cerebellum. This makes up the posterior and inferior portion of the brain. It is functionally connected with the cerebral cortex, the basal nuclei, brainstem, and spinal cord. And interactions between these regions together will coordinate movements. Anatomically, the cerebellum is divided into two cerebellar hemispheres, connected by a structure called the vermis. Ridges called folia will cover the exterior cerebellar surface, separated by a shallow sulci, and this will increase the overall area of the region. So here's your brainstem right here, okay? This is the cerebellum. You can see it's a bilobed structure. The cerebellum is actually going to be divided into three lobes: anterior, posterior, and follicular nodular lobes. The cerebellar cortex is composed of gray matter, and the cortex is extremely folded, and branching white matter is called the arbor vitae because it actually resembles that of tree branches. One of the main functions of the cerebellum is this is the area of the brain that is going to provide the blueprint for movement. So what happens is if you want to move a muscle, the cerebellum receives information from this cortex saying, we want to move this muscle. The cerebellum takes all somatosensory information, meaning, is this muscle currently contracted? Is it relaxed? Where is it in space? And then it comes up with a blueprint on how to accomplish that particular movement or of the muscle or muscles. And then once that blueprint has been developed, it will then send it back to the cerebral cortex, which will then send the command down to the muscle. So again, the main function of the cerebellum is that this is involved in actual movements, skeletal muscle movements. The brainstem, this is one of the oldest components of the brain. It is vital to our immediate survival, as its nuclei control many basic homeostatic functions. such as your heart rate and breathing rhythms. It controls many reflexes, such as program automatic responses to stimuli, functions in movement, sensation, and maintaining alertness. The brainstem is located inferior to the diencephalon and anterior to the cerebellum and superior to the spinal cord on the mid-sagittal section of the brain. It extends to the level of the foramen magnum along with the fourth ventricle deep within the brainstem and is continuous with the spinal cord and the central canal of the spinal cord. So looking here, we can see this is our brainstem region right here. Okay, so again, this whole thing up here is going to be the cortex. Here's our diencephalon, this region right here. Here's your cerebellum. You can see the arbor vitae structure of the white matter. And then again, this structure right here is the brainstem. There are three subdivisions. You have the midbrain, which is the superior portion, the pons, which is the middle portion, and the medulla oblongata, which is the inferior portion. Fibers of the cerebellum and related nuclei will travel through portions of the brainstem where they either synapse with nuclei found there or they progress on to other destinations within the cortex or the spinal cord. Nuclei of the reticular formation. This is a group of connected nuclei scattered throughout the brainstem. Many functions of the reticular formation is regulation of respiration, blood pressure, your sleep-wake cycles, pain perception, and consciousness. You're then also going to have tracts of white matter between the spinal cord and the brain. Nearly all pathways to and from the brain and spinal cord travel through the brainstem. They have to. The brainstem is going to sort of monitor and respond to all of these vital life functions. The cranial nerve nuclei. Many cranial nerves will originate in the brainstem. Their nuclei have many sensory, motor, and autonomic responsibilities. Remember, autonomic is you do not have any conscious control over any of these functions. So here we can see the brainstem. This is the diencephalon right up here. Then you have your midbrain, pons, and the medulla. A little more details. The midbrain is inferior to the diencephalon. It surrounds the cerebral aqueduct, which is a structure that connects the third and fourth ventricles. It is also known as the mesencephalon. It is the shortest and most superior brainstem region. It's going to include the superior and inferior colliculi. These are structures that protrude from the posterior surface of the brainstem. Two paired projections that form the roof of the midbrain, which is called the tectum. And this region is involved in visual and auditory functions, respectively. And it also projects to the thalamus. Other structures in the midbrain include the substantia nigra. This is a darkly pigmented region whose neurons work with the basal nuclei. The substantia nigra is responsible for controlling movements. People that have Parkinson's disease, you see degeneration in the substantia nigra, and they're unable to control muscle contractions. The red nucleus, this is posterior to the substantia nigra. This communicates with the cerebellum, spinal cord, and other regions involved in regulating movement as well. And the role in humans is not fully understood. The pons is inferior to the midbrain. It has a prominent anterior surface that contains descending motor tracts from the crux cerebri, some of which pass through the pons en route to the spinal cord. Other tracts enter the cerebellum by way of the middle cerebellar pundicle, and the reticular formation and cranial nerve nuclei are located in the posterior to these tracts. The pontine nuclei of the pons have many roles, including the regulation of movement, breathing, reflexes, and complex functions associated with sleep and arousal. Most important out of this is going to be the breathing aspect. The medulla is the most inferior structure of the brainstem. It is continuous with the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. Pyramids on the anterior side of the medulla contain the upper motor neuron fibers of the corticospinal tracts, called the pyramidal tract, as they travel from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. Okay, so again, looking here, we can see the various regions of the brain, the four main regions, as well as some other functional regions. This also goes over a summary of those structures and their functions. These three slides are extremely important as far as sort of summarizing down a lot of what these areas of the brain are doing. I think if you know the main functions that are listed here, the substructures and the structures within each of the four regions of the brain, pretty much what's on these three slides, that is sufficient. I mean, you should know what these general regions are. Yes, you're going to see some overlap between these various regions. But these three particular slides, the structures here, the cerebrum, the cortex, the diencephalon, the regions there, the cerebellum coordinates voluntary movement, and then the brainstem, midbrain, pons, medulla, and all the functions that are responsible, such as if you look here for the pons, regulation of breathing, reflexes, and your sleep-wake cycles. So these are three excellent slides. Okay, and this is going to be the end of part 2.